Hello, I'm Abby Gondek, the Morgenthau Scholar in Residence at the FDR Library in Hyde Park, New York. And I am going to be talking to you today about part of my online exhibit about Jewish organizational conflict as fuel for State Department delays. And this is the second video to describe this part of the exhibit. So I definitely recommend checking out my previous videos. I also created two videos to give you background on my role as the Morgenthau Scholar in Residence, the types of research that I do, the types of resources that I use at the library, and a little bit of introduction to some of the projects that I've worked on so far. So my role as the Morgenthau Scholar in Residence is part of the Morgenthau Holocaust Collections Project, which is a digital history and pathfinding initiative to raise awareness of the FDR Library's unique but underexplored resources for Holocaust studies. The goal of the Morgenthau Project and my role as the Scholar in Residence is to open new pathways for findability using digital scholarship to explore these Holocaust-related records. So the first thing I wanted to do is just give you a background on this particular exhibit and to kind of give you a bigger picture. And then we'll go into the details of the second part of the exhibit, which is about Zionism as one of the central areas of contention between the two organizations that I'm going to be talking about today. So this exhibit about Jewish organizational conflict is part of a larger exhibit which is called Jewish Refugee Children and the Establishment of the War Refugee Board, a path through the Morgenthau Diaries and the War Refugee Board Papers. So this mini exhibit, which is part of the larger exhibit, explores the tensions, both real and imagined, between Jewish organizations based on their positions regarding Zionism and Palestine. And this is something that I brought up in previous videos, that the issue of Palestine and where the children from France should be sent was a very central issue to the debates between the two organizations, which were the Joint Distribution Committee and the World Jewish Congress, but also the conflicts between the state and the Treasury Department. So the State Department in particular emphasized these conflicts between these two organizations in order to delay the Treasury's issuance of a license to the Joint Distribution Committee. And a license to operate in enemy territory, which I've also talked about in previous videos, was crucial for the JDC to rescue Jewish children from France. The State Department not only delayed issuance, but also took action that would threaten the effective implementation of the license. So there is another exhibit that talks about the larger conflict between state and treasury, and also provides background on the factors which have been cited to explain the creation of the War Refugee Board, which I talk about also in a previous video. Clashes between these two particular organizations feature prominently in the documents related to this time period and the specific case of, quote, abandoned Jewish children in France, so children whose parents had been deported already. Thus, the Jewish organizational conflict, in addition to the struggle between treasury and state, should be considered as factors which contributed to the overall frustration felt by the Treasury Department staff, which led to the creation of the War Refugee Board. So in the video I did directly before this one, I talked about the foundation of the conflict between the two organizations, but also between state and treasury. This page highlights both key figures and also specific archival documents that reveal the contentious relationship between the World Jewish Congress and the Joint Distribution Committee. These tensions were reported not only by government representatives, but also by the organizations themselves. John Paley, pictured here, who was the executive director of the War Refugee Board, was disturbed by this friction, which he felt would interfere with rescue, and held to his position that the destination of the refugee children from France should only be decided once they were definitively saved. A cable which demonstrates the conflict between the Zionist World Jewish Congress and the non-Zionist Joint Distribution Committee about where the children from France should be sent. So I wanted to show you where I actually found this document in the War Refugee Board Papers. So this is from the ambassador to Portugal, whose name was Raymond Henry Norweb, and it was sent to Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State. And here's an image of Cordell Hull. To access this particular cable, I was searching through the records of the War Refugee Board. Box 46 has records that are related to the evacuation of children from France to Spain and Portugal. So folder 15 is actually the second one here, which I already have open, and I already found the cable that I wanted. It's number 1168. So this particular cable was sent in April 1944, and right away you see that there is a mention of Isaac Weissman, who was the leader of the World Jewish Congress in Portugal. And he had an organization, but it lacked sufficient funds. It mentions that the World Jewish Congress wants to send the majority of the children to Palestine because they were a Zionist organization. Visas are immediately available here with preference to children to go to Palestine. This presents a problem as there will be a conflict between Zionist and non-Zionist Jewish organizations, and here they're referring to the Joint Distribution Committee, regarding the ultimate destination of the children. This is from Norweb in Portugal to Cordell Hull. So he's saying from here, meaning from Portugal, it seems easier and less expensive to send the children to Palestine than to the United States. Why were there these conflicts? This is something I've talked about before. But the main issue was where to send the children, but also whether to use legal or illegal methods. So not only was the World Jewish Congress Zionist in its orientation, but it also was in contact with underground movements and used illegal means to help refugees, in contrast to the Joint Distribution Committee, which was neutral on the Zionist question and preferred legally acceptable methods of aid. However, I found that the Joint did send children to Palestine, escaping from France into Portugal, and then they did send them to Palestine. However, it wasn't their kind of only preference. So the World Jewish Congress was really set on sending the children to Palestine, and the Joint Distribution Committee was open to multiple different options. From Paley to Dexter, and sent from Hull to Norweb for Robert Dexter. So this is cable number 1229, dated May 1st, but it's referring to earlier cables. So like, for example, this one, 1168 from April 19th, was the one that we were just looking at. Okay, so Paley says, in connection with proposals of Weissman concerning rescue of hidden children from France, you are requested immediately to contact Dr. Joseph Schwartz of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, who, as you know, is extremely competent and experienced in this field. So Dexter is expected to collaborate with Joint Distribution Committee and Joseph Schwartz. However, the problem is that Isaac Weissman from the World Jewish Congress had major issues with the Joint Distribution Committee. And as I'll talk about in a subsequent video, which is the next part of this mini exhibit, the War Refugee Board representatives definitely took sides. So Robert Dexter sided with Isaac Weissman of the World Jewish Congress, whereas Refugee Board representatives in like John Paley and also James Mann, who was sent to Portugal to try to resolve some of these conflicts, he actually also sided with the Joint Distribution Committee. So both Paley and James Mann sided with the Joint Distribution Committee. As you can see here, because Paley is recommending that Joseph Schwartz be the main person to contact related to rescuing children. So this recommendation that the World Jewish Congress and the Joint Distribution Committee should work together was very difficult to put into practice because of some underlying tensions between the organizations, which gets very interesting. So I'll go over that in my subsequent video. But it had to do with power, and because the World Jewish Congress didn't have the access to the same funding as the Joint Distribution Committee did. And also because, of course, the Joint Distribution Committee was not set on sending the children to Palestine, whereas the World Jewish Congress was. And so there was some accusations of the two organizations taking children from each other and claiming responsibility for getting the children out. And so there was a lot of back and forth between the organizations, which clearly would create difficulty to actually implement rescue, which was why Paley was so focused on just getting the kids out and then figuring out later where they would go. So on April 22nd, when children began to arrive in Spain, the Joint Distribution Committee took credit for their escape through the Pyrenees. So Paley argued that the rescue program would be greatly endangered if these two organizations could not cooperate. Here is an image of Robert Dexter. So he was a Unitarian minister. And originally he was the executive director of the Unitarian Service Committee. And later he became the War Refugee Board representative in Lisbon. And then when he became the War Refugee Board rep, his wife, Elizabeth, became the director of the Unitarian Service Committee. So based on my research, there were underlying conflicts between this organization and the Joint Distribution Committee. And there was a closer alliance between the Unitarian Service Committee and the World Jewish Congress and Isaac Weissman. So there was an underlying connection already, which led Robert Dexter to side with Isaac Weissman rather than Joseph Schwartz and the Joint Distribution Committee. Here's an image of Joseph Schwartz. He was the chairman of the Executive Council of the JDC from 1945 to 1948. This cable that is from Joseph Schwartz in Lisbon to Moses Levitt in New York City, so back to the headquarters. And this is showing how the conflicts were not just being talked about by the War Refugee Board and John Paley and Cordell Hull, but the conflicts were felt within the organizations themselves. Joseph Schwartz in this cable, which was from, May 8th or May 6th, he is telling his supervisor, Moses Levitt, that the World Jewish Congress, Isaac Weissman, although he doesn't mention Isaac Weissman, has set up separate facilities for children who may arrive from France. And this was alarming because Isaac Weissman was refusing to use existing facilities provided by the Joint Distribution Committee. And this was, of course, because of underlying resentments that Isaac Weissman felt. Isaac Weissman felt that he had been basically persecuted and targeted by the Joint Distribution Committee in the past, and that his representatives had been threatened that if they didn't turn over the children to the Joint Distribution Committee, that they would be imprisoned and things like that. So he had a lot of resentments from the past. And I think that was why he didn't want to work with the Joint Distribution Committee. Schwartz explains that the alleged reason for not wanting to use the JDC's facilities was that the JDC opposed the children's immigration to Palestine. But of course, it wasn't that the JDC opposed sending the children to Palestine. It was just that they were open to other possibilities in addition to Palestine. Paley is really preferring the Joint Distribution Committee. And so he's saying that Robert Dexter should use his power as the War Refugee Board representative to prevent competitive duplication with the main goal of saving lives. And though he appreciated having Isaac Weissman's perspectives, they wanted to hear from Joseph Schwartz and Dexter. And also Paley reminded Dexter that JDC was the one who had the license to carry out rescue from Portugal, and they had the funds. This is a cable for Dexter from Paley. So this is the narrative that I was just explaining. This is the actual document that it's referring to. Here we have, as you know, the JDC is presently licensed to carry on a rescue program from Portugal and has substantial funds available. And also that the War Refugee Board isn't funding these rescues themselves. They're relying on private sources, meaning these Jewish organizations, to fund the rescue. What is coming up in the next video? So that is where the War Refugee Board is taking sides. So explore that in a little bit more depth. So Robert Dexter, as I explained before, he sided with the World Jewish Congress and accused the Joint of falsely claiming responsibility for rescue. But also the War Refugee Board headquarters in Washington, D.C., you have John Paley, who seemed to have a preference for the Joint Distribution Committee. And also James Mann, when he visited Portugal to try to resolve these conflicts, he spent more time with the JDC representatives than he did with Isaac Weissman. So I'm going to go into more depth about these interpersonal conflicts and organizational conflicts, which could have contributed to problems in rescuing children from France because of the organizational conflicts. So the conflicts between these two Jewish relief and rescue organizations were expressed by the representatives of the organizations themselves. The conflicts were also dramatized by the State Department in order to bolster their efforts to delay the issuance of licenses for relief and rescue operations. Coming out of their different philosophies on Zionism and Palestine, the World Jewish Congress and the Joint Distribution Committee fought each other and disparaged or discredited each other's work in the effort to receive preferential treatment from the War Refugee Board and the US government at large. Rescuing Jewish children was no simple task, since it involved navigating the contentious relationships between Treasury and state and between Jewish organizations. The battles between Jewish organizations were central to the tensions that existed between Treasury and state, but also played a foundational role in the lead up to the establishment of the War Refugee Board, as well as its ongoing work. Thank you for listening, and I hope you tune in to my next video, which will talk about how the War Refugee Board representatives took sides between the Joint Distribution Committee and the World Jewish Congress.